you're given, that's how we live it. Don't be mad at the system, it's simply how we've existed. I hear a lot of people talking like they politicians and choose to be an accountant because it's safe in a business. Not because they want to do it, just because they heard it pays. And who the fuck wants to be poor knowing that's how we've been raised? Society is getting heavy, I can feel the weight. The pressure of success is like 100 million pounds of shit.
How are you guys doing today? It's Anthony Gangi. Welcome to another episode of Tier Talk. I'm holding the mic. You know, new and improved Tier Talk. Evolution. Tier Talk 2.0. He holds a mic. You know, that I'm stepping up in technology. Hey, guys, we have a great dialogue coming your way. It's going to be me and Connie. We're going to talk about how inmates can die in custody. It's a very important topic. Me, Russ, and Connie touched on it yesterday. We went through a lot of ways that inmates can die in custody. It's going to get released on the Tier Talk podcast, which comes out every Friday around 1 p.m. Multiple platforms, Spotify, Apple Tunes, the list goes on. But we want to have a more deep discussion. The podcast is about an hour or a little less. We thought that we could have a little bit more of a deep discussion through the Tier Talk channel, and I really enjoyed the dialogue yesterday. So we have the custody side, which I'm going to bring in. I'm also going to have some of the thoughts that Russ had yesterday because, as I said, we had a great dialogue yesterday. And we also have Connie, who was also on yesterday, but she's able to be with us today, and she's going to give the medical perspective. Hey, Connie, what's going on? How was the dialogue we had yesterday?
The dialogue was good. I mean, I thought it was informative. I mean, you know, Russ always bring, you know, that whole custody side to it that, you know, as a medical person, I'm not thinking about. So it's always great to be in school when Russ is talking. But also I enjoyed just the exchange of us really learning from each other, because on the medical side, there are ways or things that happen, you know, when we are dependent on you all, despite, you know, us working in our own little silos. So it's good to see how we can come together and we collaborate on, you know, saving these offenders' lives.
Well, I think that's one of the things that we highlighted. The most important part by the end of this is to understand that there has to be that good working relationship between custody and medical. So, Connie, you mind introducing yourself again to our audience and the stuff that you're doing, the podcast, the training, what's going on?
Sure. So Connie Alleyne, I am the founder and president of the Civilian Corrections Academy. We are online. We are doing our best to make sure that civilians get the training that they need. And interestingly enough, we've got officers reaching out saying, how can I get the training? So I love to see those, because that means that the work that we're doing is not in vain, that we're seeing that there is some cross-functional learning that we can have as we train with each other. I'm also doing the Fly Behind the Wall podcast. We are season 2, episode 12, just released on Monday, really talking about leadership and the leader as the advocate. And I'm also doing conversations with Connie, which is more on my website, really just getting to know me and me answering questions that people are emailing. So it's a good way to kind of just spread the knowledge the best way I can and engage with my audience on different platforms.
Yeah, and they're all great platforms. I love both of the podcasts. A lot of good information provided on both. And obviously, I'm very familiar with the training that you provide for the Civilian Correction Academy. So for those facilities that aren't doing it, you know, here it is. We have something. If you're watching the show, definitely reach out to Connie, and she can go ahead and tell you how you can sign up for the training that she offers. All right, guys, when we come back, we're going to dive into how inmates can die in custody, a very important topic, and something I think that I don't think we've ever touched on this before. I mean, yeah, we've touched on it when we talked about deaths, but we never actually specifically gave a whole show to it. So it was a great recommendation, and I can't wait to see where this dialogue goes. We're going to kind of continue off, but a little bit more in depth. So, guys, if you haven't, the show Tier Talks for you, brave men and women that work in corrections. So please subscribe, interact, engage, comment, hit that bell. The bell's going to notify you every time I post a video. We're going to go to our sponsor, and we come back. We're going to talk about inmate deaths. Stand by.
I wanted to attend a university that had an intelligence program. I wanted to look at problems different. I wanted to increase my critical thinking abilities. AMU offered those avenues to expand. Obtaining your degree as an adult, you're actually paying yourself and investing in yourself. You can't put a dollar on it, it's priceless. It's something that can never be taken away from you.
American Military University. Learn from the leader.
Guys, Inmate Manipulation is a course that is highly needed. It's the process that's so slow moving and subtle that you don't realize it's happening. When inmates choose to manipulate, they manipulate our need to react. Situational awareness and insight is going to save your career. It's going to save you from doing foolish things. Listen to your gut. So the more insight we have, the more we can recognize what isn't so overt, and we can correct our behavior before we fall into a trap that we can't get out of. If you allow an inmate to pull you out of your prescribed role, you are opening up a door for a host of problems.
Inmate Manipulation, the psychology behind inmate manipulation. Available now. Link in description. And we are back. Okay, Connie, so the dialogue we had yesterday, we went over a lot of situations that inmates obviously, unfortunately, may not survive from. We talked about that. And we talked about the end result is we always have to be on point, because you know that the outside, when you have an inmate death, they're looking to come at the agency, whether it's going to be for negligence, recklessness, abuse of force, whatever it is. So I think topics like this are great, because we're going to cover the liability side as well as we go into it, because I thought that's what we did a little bit yesterday, correct?
We did, but I also think this topic is really good because we raised the awareness of ourselves, right? So you've got many staff who may not work in these kind of live facilities where there's always some action going on, right? And so here are some things you can think about, because these things are happening in the system throughout the nation, not just what's happening in your facility. So I think yesterday we touched on, pretty broad, but I also think we did kind of touch on John Neville again. And I think for today, we may want to focus just really on like, what are those leading causes of death, and like, how do they happen? Like more the, I guess, technical side of things, of how things happen behind the wall.
Right. And Russ did want us to remind those out there that we save more lives, and that's usually not put out there. So again, yes, we do have inmates die. It's sad, but no one ever really takes note of all the lives we save, whether it's from custody, whether it's from medical. So let's also take note. Thank you to the brave men and women from medical, from custody, from just to the agencies itself that do save the lives of the inmates, because I believe you don't get enough recognition on that. So let's start with the medical perspective first. You mentioned some good statistics yesterday after the show. It wasn't aired during the show, Connie. So I guess it's good for us to revisit that now. One of the things you mentioned was about the different, I think jails have more suicides than prisons, but prisons have more let me ask you. So you said jails have more suicides, correct?
Right. So right now, as I know it, the leading cause of death for inmates in local jails is suicides. Suicides actually count for 1/3 of all deaths. Heart disease is the second leading cause of death. And in prisons, cancer is actually the leading cause of death.
Yeah, I was going to say cancer. I was trying to, but for some reason I was thinking of just old age, because we talked about that. So let's start first with those medical emergencies. Obviously every facility is going to have them. And as much as we try our best to save that inmate, to preserve that life, sometimes it's just not in the cards. And I do want people to know something, people from the outside that may not know this. Even though you can have an inmate that we know is dead, we still continue to work on that inmate exhaustively until it's been determined by, I'm assuming, a doctor or a paramedic or something that, okay, the inmate has been pronounced dead. And I've seen it. I've seen staff catch an inmate at the right time. Just unfortunately, the inmate's already passed. And what I mean by right time is they got there within the half-an-hour checks. They call the code, they pull the inmate out, and the inmate is clearly gone, but they're still pushing and pushing and pushing. I mean, to the point where they're exhausted and overwhelmed. Medical comes in, medical starts to take over, custody staff kind of backs away, but when the nurse gets tired, custody staff will continue. They kind of rotate if there's not enough medical there. But you see this great partnership, and this can go on for quite some time until someone comes in and actually pronounces the inmate deceased. Correct, Connie?
Correct. So you have to be, whoever the highest level of medical authority is the only person who could declare someone as deceased. So essentially we continue CPR until otherwise instructed, and really the rotation is because after an extended period of time of chest compressions and breaths, like your body is just physically tired. Your arms are tired. Your lung capacity becomes diminished. You know, there's certain things that happen as you're trying to perform CPR. It's exhausting, especially if you've got hours of doing that, depending on how long it takes for, you know, the emergency response team or the paramedic, whoever comes to the facility.
Right, and I've seen good rotations where, you know, custody starts first, medical picks up, and if medical doesn't have backup, custody like, okay, you want me to go in? And because they can kind of see, okay, this person's getting tired, let me go in. And they keep it going until, you're right, someone does come in and pronounce the individual deceased. And I want to mention at this point, because Connie brought it up yesterday, just to touch on, because we had the death of Epstein a while back, and it was about those tours. You know, we're going to have inmates that are going to die. Unfortunately, we're not going to be able to catch it, you know, because it happens. If they're willing to take their own lives, they're going to find a way to do it. They're going to go based on your last interaction with them and say, okay, well, he's probably not going to be back for another 15 or 30 minutes. I'm going to do something foolish. And let's be honest, for the ones that we do catch, the ones that were sincere, it's experience. It's something in the air that told us, let me go back and check on this guy because it's a change of habit or something that's not right. And you listen to your gut. But with that said, if you're not doing your tours, even if you have an inmate that dies of old age and you don't discover that body for a few hours later, there's going to be a liability there. There's going to be a sign of negligence because there's always going to be people in the air that's going to wonder, could you have saved that inmate? So Connie made mention, I'm sure she'll do it a little bit now, is the importance of telling the truth when you log. You know, if you're told to do those half an hour tours, do them. If you couldn't do it for one round, then you better put in the book why you couldn't do it for that one round. What happened? What was it that, you know, pulled you aside to something else? But again, even if the inmate's death was natural and you're not doing the tours, the discovery of the body is just as important as discovering the attempt, correct?
Correct. I mean, you can't change the fact that if it's a natural cause, like, it's going to happen. But, you know, what I've seen is that, you know, folks scramble to go document in the log. But, you know, my reality is, I feel like the reality is that when the investigation begins and the process begins and you're reviewing the cameras and you're like, when things don't align, it puts you in a much worse position than if you simply didn't do it and you could own, like, something else was happening. There was some sort of conflicting demand at the time. You had someone at your desk asking for something. You were in the middle of another crisis. Like, that's the reality of where we work. So it's better that you're honest as opposed to trying to falsify the log, because the log is a legally binding document.
Right. And I also want to mention, before we go into the specific causes of death for inmates that we may find in our facilities, but again, nothing's inclusive. Nothing's all inclusive. We're just going to give you the top ones that we know of. If you can think of more, comment, you know, please. We're very curious because maybe we could do a whole nother episode on it. But I do want to mention again the partnership between medical and custody, specifically medical and custody, because usually they're the ones that are going to respond. Custody may be the first response. Medical may have to come to assist. There's no jockeying for position here. We need a partnership. We need to understand what the needs are from both partners, and that goes through communication. Correct, Connie? How important is, you know, that working relationship when we have that code or we have that possible loss of life coming our way?
Absolutely. We don't have the time to waste. Time is of the essence in many of these cases. You know, the time we spent squabbling over who should do what, we just need not do that. Medical comes on the scene. They have the level of expertise needed to stabilize someone. I think it's okay for custody to step back, let medical do what they need. And if custody support is needed, whoever that medical lead is, that medical lead can say, hey, can you do X, Y, Z for me? That way they know that the tasks that are needed in the moment are being handled, and there's that accountability that goes with it. I think the partnership is trusting that medical knows what they're doing, and that if they do need your support, they ask for it. And there are times, I think, where custody and medical have worked so well together that custody may just jump in and say, okay, I'm here. What do you need me to do? Right? Because we welcome that as well. It shows that, you know what, you respect that in this instance, I'm the one who may have the expertise. This is within my scope, and you'll accept my guidance in this instance. But I also think for us, we have to be willing to have those conversations, have those exchanges. A lot of times, because of HIPAA, there may be some hesitation to communicate with custody during a code or during whatever, but our reality is that we're trying to save a life. I think we can work through all the other stuff, like the rest of the bureaucracy and the politics, but as long as we're working more collaboratively, we're in a pretty good space.
You know, I would also like to see some good training between medical and custody working together. I mean, really high-paced situational training to see how they do work together. Let's put them in a situation where you have a non-compliant inmate and see if, you know, custody understands what medical needs and medical understands what custody needs, and if they can work together through whatever obstacle it is. Because, again, it is a balance of safety and security, and sometimes medical may not be aware of what custody has to do, but again, custody may not be aware of what medical has to do. So this is a good way to kind of go through the training and then stop and ask, okay, what was that for? You know, why'd you need me to take that? How important is that? And I don't think we do a lot of that. I know we do have training, but it seems like the trainings are isolated. Okay, so custody will deal with this, medical deals with this on their end, but why don't we bring people together and then see how it works when we're live, correct?
Yeah, I mean, I've seen it play out where, you know, we have officers assigned to the mental health unit, and we actually do specific trainings that include the officer in that unit, so he can identify someone who's decompensated and maybe pull a nurse and be like, hey, I think something's going on with this guy. You know, oftentimes, depending on how big the unit is, how many inmates are in there, you may or may not have all the hands that you need. And custody is a great set of hands and eyes to have when we're in those units, and people decompensate really quickly. You know, I think the same thing in medical. You know, you're in the medical unit and you see something happening. I think sometimes custody may not know exactly what's happening, but I've seen custody say, hey, listen, that one over there is acting a little squirrely. Could you check them out? Like, who knows what squirrely means, right? But when a nurse goes to do their assessment, they figure out what's wrong, right? And really, many times it's life-saving, just because something was a little off and the officer followed their gut.
Yeah, and I would like to also take that up a notch with the live training. So now, you know, we have an inmate that's non-compliant. Let's call it medical, and let's run a test, you know, like a very live scenario-based test. I just want to see the partnership, because I believe that some of parts of the training are isolated, and I would like to see them both come together to see how both work, how they blend together. Now, we were talking about some of the deaths yesterday, so I would like to talk about real quick the medical emergencies. And by the way, we all know that inmates sometimes play games. We've talked about the boy that cries wolf. We have to respond each and every time as if it's serious. I mean, there are reasons why inmates may want to fake a suicide. You know, it's motivation. Maybe they want to have that insane plea, maybe escape a trip from court, maybe to manipulate a housing move, even seizures. There have been times where inmates have fake seizures to get out of the unit and to be placed in medical. I mean, I know sometimes it's funny. You could have a lot of facilities that don't have any AC in the housing units, but they have AC in medical, and some of them will fake seizures to get to medical to get that AC. Me and Connie had a discussion yesterday. Again, it was about John Neville the other day, and we talked about seizures. And, you know, if seizures are prolonged, you said something past 5 minutes, that could be a serious problem. So even though one of the biggest medical emergencies custody responds to, I think one of them is seizures. One of them is heart concerns. You know, sometimes a lot of inmates will come out and say, I have chest pains, overdoses, or drug-related issues, substance abuse problems. And am I missing any? Those are usually the top three.
So usually if there's any head trauma, like if they're out playing a game or something, someone falls, any possible head trauma is usually treated just like there's something significant, because you don't want someone to become unconscious. Certainly we have a lot of attention we pay to the diabetics, who can decompensate pretty quickly, as well as those who are hypertensive. So pretty much those who have those chronic diseases that we have to manage, we try to make sure, like, when those emergencies spike, that we're on it.
I forgot about the diabetics. I mentioned that yesterday, by the way. I used to get a lot of those codes for the diabetics late at night, like around midnight or 1, because either was something they ate or something they shouldn't be in. And it got to that point where I was like, you know what? Every night I would go to medical, get an apple or something, and then pass it off, or go to food service, get an apple, and pass it off over to the inmate, obviously with medical's approval, because there was something the inmate was doing at night that he crashed. And it would be like every night we're going into a cell. And I remember medical telling them, you need to have this before you go to sleep, or you need to eat this before you go to sleep. So just to, reinsure, medical's like, yeah, I don't have an issue with that. So I go in and pop open and give an apple through the food port. He goes, Gangi, you realize I said eat it, because we're coming in every night, and, I'm low staffing on overnight. So, that medical code can tie up my whole crew. So, but again, those were some of the emergent issues that we had, and each one is taken seriously. You even mentioned head injuries. Most likely that could turn out to be a 911 activation, because again, you don't know how bad the person was injured. What are some of the other reasons why medical would go ahead and initiate a 911 activation? Exactly what is a 911 activation?
So if someone has some sort of medical emergency that we cannot stabilize in the facility, if someone's required some additional diagnostic testing so that we can rule out anything life-threatening, essentially we would activate 911. Certainly if we have someone detoxing, if we don't have, most facilities should have some sort of detox protocol. But if they're going into tremors, if there are other things that are beyond what we could manage within a facility, we would then activate 911, because they require a higher level of care that we are able to provide in a facility.
Right. Now, some facilities have infirmaries. Some facilities actually have hospitals, even hospice care. What is the difference between an infirmary and a hospital?
So I find that in the infirmary, that's where someone is, they're not well enough to be in general population. They do require a higher level of medical care, but they don't necessarily require long-term hospital care. So I think with the two of them, so for example, one of the facilities that I worked in had a machine for dialysis. That person might live in the infirmary because they require the care, but they're not technically hospitalized. There are times where if there is some sort of medical emergency that requires a level of, say, maybe inpatient care, maybe intense care for a couple of days, they may be in a hospital setting for that. And then once they're released, they go back to their unit. In other places where it's more long-term requirement, so like we have someone who has cancer and they're receiving chemotherapy or something, and so they're living in our infirmary and they get daily care in the infirmary.
Yeah, I know that, again, some facilities may not be equipped to have a hospital, but they do have some type of immediate response there. So like an infirmary could be enough to help until we can get some form of longer term care, like you mentioned. Mm-hmm. And also, guys, there's a lot of older inmates in our population that could die of, you said, cancer or natural causes or whatnot. If you work in those units, please make sure you do your tours, because the inmate died of natural causes. Again, just reiterating, it's worth saying again, doesn't mean that you're cleared. Doesn't mean that there could not be a lawsuit when, again, discovering the body. So I think we touched on medical emergencies. Again, just treat everything seriously. Even if you may feel the person's faking it, it doesn't matter. Medical will even say the same thing. We're going to go through this again. But having said that, you got to play it out. You got to do the whole thing, because you never know when that person really is having that seizure, or when they really are making that attempt to hang themselves, which will bring us, let's just kind of cross into the next one, suicides. Now, we discussed it briefly a second ago, but whether the person does have an intent to take their lives or they don't, and what does that mean, Gangi? You just said suicide. Well, there are some suicides that the motivation isn't to take the life. The attempt is for something else, whether it is, again, to something as simple as a house move. But having said that, we need to make sure that we check, because each time an inmate that may not want to have the intent to kill themselves may find themselves in a situation where they can't escape and they will die. Because again, they're taking it to the extreme, because there could even be some officers or some staff members that will actually tell the inmate, I know you're faking it. I know you're BSing it. And then what happens is the inmate may take that as a challenge. Oh, really? Okay. And then even though maybe they were faking it, they're going to step it up, because they're really relying on us to catch them. The inmate that wants to get caught, the inmate that's manipulating the move, he's seeing exactly when custody is doing their rounds, or medical, whoever the staff member is that's supervising them. And he's waiting, or she's waiting. And the moment they get close, they go all out. and they're really expecting you to come in and save them. That attempt is for you to come in and save them. Now, if they go a little too far and really trust that you can get them and you can't, I mean, they're going to hurt themselves. I mean, to some point where they won't come back. So again, we still have to treat it seriously, because in the end, they may not want to take their own lives, but the foolish act that they're doing is going to say, well, I don't care what you want at this point. I'm going to go ahead and we're just going to take that life. So, and obviously you've seen that, right? You've seen attempts that you know for a fact that, okay, this inmate's playing a game, but now look what just happened.
Right. So, I mean, just before I left, I mean, I had a situation where this offender was in a relationship with another offender, and the relationship went south. And, you know, during the mental health encounter, you know, she was talking about all these things that was going on. And, you know, there was some suicidal ideation during that interaction, you know, but little did we know, like, this offender had made calls to, like, you know, family. They were actually giving away their commissary. They were doing all of these things that, you know, you step back and you look at the big picture, it's like, oh my goodness, these are all telltale signs, right? But we didn't expect what was going to happen. We didn't expect that everyone knew this offender. We didn't expect that, you know, she was actually going to complete a suicide. You know, maybe she did expect we would have been able to save her, but not in this instant. In this instant, it was just in between rounds. So the logbook was clear. The officer had just done his rounds. Her cellmate had just walked out to go to some service or something. And it was just that small window of opportunity. And by the time officer comes back, like, it was already done. Now the code is still called and everyone gets involved, and, you know, we follow protocols, but the reality is that it was already too late. I mean, I've even witnessed in male facility, I would have never thought of it, but an offender had put their sheet inside the toilet and flushed it. And I was like, what? Like, I'd never heard of that. And so it actually choked him to death, which, and of course the challenge is, how do you get the sheet from in the toilet? So of course custody comes and they're cutting away, but it was kind of already too late. But it's like these ways that if someone's intention is to commit suicide, they figure out how to do it. That's just it. You know, we can do our best, I think, to mitigate the risk, right? Like, in certain facilities, you won't see exposed piping on the ceiling. You won't see certain things that are opportunities if someone, or if anyone for that matter, were suicidal. But, you know, things happen.
Well, you know, you mentioned a unique way of doing it. Obviously, when inmates they're motivated to take their lives. By the way, if we catch it, it's mostly luck, as I mentioned. It's just something that, you know, made us go back and do a double check, because most of the time, again, we have to be unpredictable in a very predictable world. You know, we have to be unpredictable within predictable parameters. So again, it's just something that says, you know what, let me go check, because this inmate never once asked me how I'm doing, you know, and then you happen to go back and you catch the person in the attempt, you call the code. I mean, I've had one where inmate was able to tie multiple sheets around a room, and then when the response team went to go in to kind of open that door, it would have been pure pressure on the person's neck, because it went around the room and tied to the door. But luckily you have good staff that caught it and put their front, don't hold on before you open that door, because there's nothing, you know, it's going around the room and tied right onto the door handle. So what you do is, when you finally know that the attempt, obviously if it's insincere or sincere, whatever it is, the same protocols are going to be put in place. If the person is going through this moment of they want to take their lives, you have to put them in an area where there's limited resources to do that until that moment passes. The person keeps on having a history of doing that, then eventually there could be a decision by mental health to have them double locked and placed into an area where they always have a cellmate. Now, not that we're expecting a cellmate to stop it, but with that said, you know, likelihood that there's another body in the cell would maybe deter. Now, with that said, sometimes if the inmate gets put into a housing unit and that cellmate decides to go to yard, then the officer should know enough to say, you know what, let me go ahead and do an extra check right now while this guy's in yard, just to make sure, you know, things are running smooth. Now, again, you can only do so much. So even if you catch the person and it may be too late, did you catch the person within a reasonable amount of time to at least make the effort? And that's the key. I know a lot of us go under stress. Oh, I can't believe they died. And, yeah, but you did a tour every half an hour. You did what was expected. So at that point here, the actions are going to be on that inmate, because that inmate, made that choice to do it and knew exactly when to do it. That's the key, again, for those that want to do it. But, and I know you've seen it, where, staff, after the suicide happens, a lot of staff go back and they wind up just thinking, like, could I have done something different? They wind up actually getting hit pretty hard with that. For some of the reasons, one of the reasons could be maybe it was an inmate that they had an okay rapport with. That's fine. It is what it is. It happens. Or it could be, this is my job. I was paid to protect this individual, and I failed to do that part of my job. I could see medical getting upset with that. Or the other part is the consequences of the Monday night quarterbackers, right? I mean, there's a lot of things that can happen after an inmate dies, and even if the officer or the medical person went above and beyond to try to bring that inmate back, correct?
Absolutely. So what we find is that, these codes happen, and especially if you have a rapport. I've seen, staff take it really hard when there are some offenders who succeed in a suicide, because why? Over the years of providing care for them, whether it's clinical services, it's mental health services, they wonder, was I not paying attention to something? Did I miss something in an assessment? It's that constant thinking back. So what was the last interaction like? Did they say something that went over my head? I wasn't thinking about it. Maybe I didn't take note of something that should have been obvious. So I think in those instances, we are our worst critic, right? Like, because we do wonder, could I have done more? I think in the other instances where people go above and beyond, and then you have that, Monday morning assessment. Now you got the video, you got all these other pieces of information that the person involved didn't have at the time, and now you're making the best decision. Sure, maybe if that person had those data points, they would have made a more accurate decision, or maybe they would have done something differently. But maybe they went above and beyond and they did everything they could have in that situation. And so, I think as we start, especially with deaths, you see a lot of blaming, who did what, who didn't do what, as opposed to what could we have done to avoid this from happening? Not so much who's at fault for this happening, which is two very different conversations.
Yeah, and we find that when we do have an inmate's death, there is going to be a bit of a scramble. One's going to be concerned about policy and procedure. That's more the management side. And the union's going to look to protect the individual. So the union may look to see where policy and procedure wasn't enough, just in case, the life wasn't saved, and the administration may push on the individual, and the union's going to come back and push on the policy. I've seen that, and that's technically the time we should be together, not divided. Little unique. Yeah. And also, I want to mention something. Custody and medical actually do work. This is where they need to work, especially with mental health, because there could be some signs that the inmate's giving when they're in the housing unit that they may not necessarily have given a mental health. So it's good communication between both parties to say, hey, listen, can you check on this person today? Something doesn't seem right. And also, even if the inmate, clearly doesn't state that they're going to harm themselves when you interview them, we talked about documentation. It's very good for custody and medical to make sure they document everything that's said, because once it's played out later on, they're going to say, well, what were the signs? Well, wait a second, let's go to the first time we interviewed them. Maybe when they came in on intake, or maybe I saw him that day for another reason. And he was asked, are you okay? And the inmate clearly said, yes, I'm okay, blah, blah, blah. So again, that documentation will really carry a lot of weight, because that's going to be pulled up, because eventually there will be a lawsuit, correct?
For sure. So when you're having that interaction, especially you might have been the last person to have an interaction with that offender, you want to make sure that that clinical record indicates everything that transpired. Here's why I met with the inmate. This is what we did when we met. Here's the intervention, and here's the planned follow-up. Like, you want to make sure that that's happened. And if you say something in that note about referring them to someone, hopefully you have actually done that. Like, I'm sending a referral to the psychiatrist, or I'm sending the referral to the psychologist, or, inmate needs, a change in medication, because oftentimes a lot of that could be driven by the psychotropic meds that they're taking, whether they're compliant or not compliant with those medications, they have different impact on the brain, on the body. And so if in fact there's a medication issue that needs to be escalated and you've documented that, just make sure that you've made sure that that referral made it to whatever doctor you were assigning them to, and that if there was medication issues, that those were escalated as well. Because when you go to those notes and you can't quite close the loop on the story, it sort of leaves open that space of vulnerability or liability.
Yeah, and sometimes inmates may say stuff general that you think nothing of, like, oh, Gant, I'm just having one of those days. It's like, oh, what does that mean? Hey, come here, come back. What does that mean, you're having one of those days? And real quick, before we close up the topic on suicide, we discussed the other day about, and again, at the beginning of the show, about jails may have more suicides because obviously you have inmates that, you know, could be first time in, whatever it is, hasn't been able to adjust to this drastic change of lifestyle. Again, you know, especially right at the very beginning when everything is happening, they could get overwhelmed. And that's when it's very important that we may have to go above and beyond, even if the inmate doesn't request it, because the situation says something different. So our experience may note that, okay, you have an individual that's going through all these concerns, but they're smiling. Yeah, that doesn't seem right. The situation says something that's a little different. So maybe we should go the extra mile, even if the inmate's not requesting, because again, the families are never going to see their relatives as killing themselves. It's just something that's very hard for them to accept. They're going to put the blame on us, however it is, whether we did it to them or whether it was reckless or just negligence. And if there's things that we could have exhausted, trust and believe we'll be tested on that. So they'll be like, okay, well, the inmate didn't say nothing like that, but, you know, look what just happened. He was charged with a sex crime. His kids got taken away. His family got, you know, a bunch of things. They cut him off. You know, we don't want to just maybe have that automatic referral based on the situations he's in. So how important is it also to understand the situation and the inmate's reaction to the situation?
So, I mean, depending on how that intake process works, you know, if they're being evaluated by a medical and mental health professional, usually part of that intake assessment, there are some questions that kind of look at their psychosocial side of their life, right? Like, so did they lose a job? What was the family situation like? So we don't necessarily ask those questions, but we try to look at the total picture of that intake, as well as whether this is a new person. Have you ever been incarcerated before? Because those who've never been incarcerated before, the shock to the system is significant. And so that's why, especially in the jail settings, you see that that spike. I think also too, I feel like in the jail setting, you're also probably going through some detox, right? Like if you came in and you were under the influence, there's a certain way that as your body is coming down off of the drugs, off of the high, and reality starts to set in, it's very difficult for many of the offenders to handle that reality of what's happening, either what they did that got them there or the fact that this is their current state of existence. The shame that's associated with it and everything else, I think certainly provides motive for suicide. So I clearly understand why, you know, the suicide rates in the jail setting are so high.
Right, and there's a lot to see here. I mean, obviously you have surface things which can't be ignored, but then there's experience that's going to look a little bit deeper. And again, it's that experience that to me is really what saves lives, because the deeper concerns are what the inmate's trying to hide. And it really takes someone that really knows the craft, whether it's custody or medical, to really say, okay, something's not right, even if it's just the way they said something or a very slight shift in character. So let's move over now to drugs. That's a concern, substance abuse. A lot of the times you could see inmates that when they overdose. Now, again, when we talked about suicides, that could include intentional overdoses, because sometimes they are intentional, where the inmate does want to die and they just take all their KOPs. But in some cases, there could be inmates that just want to try a bad drug out there right now, and it happens. And we all know how it could come in, whether it's staff, whether it's family members, whether it's a vendor, you know, whether it's coming through the mail. I mean, there's many ways that it can come in. We know that. And as you take and take and take away, inmates become more inventive. And again, it's just it's a game of cat and mouse. You know, we're trying to do our best to prevent, but we don't want to. We know it could happen, but we don't want to make it easy for them. That's the key. We want to have some obstacles up there that make them at least think about doing it, because the chance that you could get caught increases. But with that said, when you have an inmate that, let's say, immediately overdoses, definitely I see the immediate connection between medical and custody. And I'll tell you automatically what I first see is we have to identify what the inmate overdosed on. So if the inmate is non-responsive, but, you know, showing the signs of, let's say they are overdosing or they're in the process of overdosing, well, then what we have here now is we need to know what it is. So immediately when medical takes over that area, that emergency response, custody is going to go right in and start searching to see if they can find out what was in the cell, what they believe the inmate was using. They'll even isolate the cellmate, because maybe the cellmate's aware. Maybe the cellmate's the one that gave them something. Maybe do a quick urine analysis on at least the cellmate, just to try to see if they can build some connection. Also, even if the inmate is responsive, sometimes they're going to lie because they don't want to get in trouble. And that's something that you have to document as medical, saying, well, I tried to find out what it was, but the inmate was not telling me, so we're going to document this. But having said that, you still have to have that exhaustive measure. You have to kind of think, if you have an inmate overdosing, right, you're going to expect the inmate not to tell you the truth. And that's where custody can come in and try to go ahead and, search the area to see what's there. But also, let me ask you a question. I'm assuming at this point with experience, there are certain types of drugs that do have a certain type of reaction. So an experienced nurse may be able to know what that person took because of the reaction they're going through, correct? It's a guess.
Could be. I mean, sometimes depending on, especially, so there's so many new drugs out there and some crazy cocktails that these inmates come up with. So it could be difficult, but we do have some very experienced detox nurses and substance abuse treatment nurses who they know their stuff, and they know if someone's just high or if someone ingested something. They usually know, and they usually ask the questions very directly. So what were you smoking tonight? Or, so they're looking at arms for track marks. They usually know exactly what. And I think with a lot of the nurses that are on, who've been there for a while, they've got the experience, they get to know these inmates too. Last time he was here, the last time she was here, it was all about heroin, right? And so when you at least have a baseline, it makes it easier for you to try to stabilize or provide treatment.
Right. And again, you're going to see a good partnership here with medical and custody, because also some meds are controlled. There's some narcotics that have to be given out. So sometimes what happens here is that maybe medical may crush it and give it to the inmate. Or you definitely should have custody in partnership with medical, looking into those inmates' mouths and kind of checking every possible hiding spot. Again, inmates are good at what they do, but you make the attempt, you put the obstacle up. And again, you want to make sure that at least I'm not making it easier for them to do something foolish. Because again, if it goes to court, they're going to say, well, the inmate's been collecting this medication. What do you have in play to stop them from taking the medication from the med line back to their cell? Well, this is what we do. This is how we do it. Again, inmates are going to find ways to circumvent, whatever we try to put in. But what are some of the KOPs that inmates can carry in some places, not all places, but that you've seen that, inmates may need immediately on their person, but that can also be a risk to them if they don't take it as prescribed?
So, we've seen aspirin as a KOP. We've also seen seasonal allergy medication as a KOP. We've tried to, I know in facilities that I've worked in, we've done our best to remove anything that the offenders could actually crush and snort. At a time we had Benadryl on the commissary, and then what did we find? They were getting high from Benadryl. They were crushing it. They were snorting it. It's one of those give or takes where it may be okay. You may use some Imodium or something, or some Mylanta could be part of that. But, where there's a will, there's a way, right? How do you make sure? Because at a point we were looking at dispensing or getting a machine that would actually dispense the KOP. So instead of them having it on them, if they wanted, you need an aspirin because you got a headache, right? You can go get an aspirin. But of course, there's that concern. What about that person who gets tons of aspirins? And then if they decide they're going to take all the aspirin at one time, you know, like, so there's certainly that fine balance of giving some freedom, also easing some of the pressure off the med line, but also keeping them safe. You know, I think we do our best to find that balance, but it isn't easy doing that.
Yeah, and I like what you said, how some people may say, well, why not just take away all their medication and have, because it's hard for the med line to go ahead and distribute to each individual as they need it. There has to be some area of self-control on that individual, and for facilities or for people that may want to hold the facility responsible because the inmate overdosed on what would be a keep-on person, you have to realize something. This individual was given direction. You know, they know how they have to take it. And if we didn't give it to them and something happened, we also would be held responsible. So it's like you can't win. Okay, so I want to move forward a little bit more. I want to talk about, we kind of touched on it yesterday, the John Neville, the restraint, you know. So sometimes, obviously, we have codes in our facility. And again, everything I've talked about here, you know, the foundation is always going to be medical working with custody. I mean, obviously, I can't think of one incident we just mentioned that would isolate or only one party's involved. It's usually going to be both parties, and definitely good communication is key. But if you have inmates that, you know, let's say have trouble breathing, and then you use OC, and then you're trying to make them comply, and they're fighting, and you have them on their stomach for prolonged periods of time, that could be a concern. That could be something that could be looked at as negligence or maybe even recklessness. And in North Carolina, unfortunately, even though you had staff go above and beyond, they had one incident that, you know, is going to be scrutinized. And unfortunately, that incident is being used to try to charge them with involuntary manslaughter based on being recklessness or negligent on the individual's life. And again, I wish the whole video got out there to see how much professional they were the whole way. But unfortunately, something did happen that caused a shift. And again, I don't want to Monday night quarterback it, but that's what people are going to focus on. But when you have issues where you know that the breathing's been compromised, you know, you have a balance between safety and security, but also that inmate's medical. And that's where you really do need that partnership between medical and custody. But I think North Carolina's even done it where medical now has autonomy over that. Like the preservation of life is going to supersede. If you have 5 custody members and they're trying to secure this person's on the stomach, you know, and they're trying to make the person compliant, and medical is trying to say, hey, I got to get this person's up. This person's been on the stomach for too long. That's actually going to wind up being the call that custody has to listen to. Get that person into a chair, get their breathing ready, because you also have 5 officers in there. Now, don't get me wrong. It's still tough to manage. Any inmate could be tough. Any inmate could be non-compliant because we're not trying to hurt the inmate. That's what makes it difficult for the staff members. We're not trying to hurt them. We're trying to help them. But with that said, 5 staff members should be able to put that inmate into a restraint chair and be able to help that inmate breathe. So now we have the inmate in a better position, and medical could also attend to whatever other needs they are, as opposed to now focusing on something else that wasn't part of the problem to begin with. You know, you could have an inmate that has, let's say, well, again, going back to John Neville, a seizure, doesn't know where they're at, and now they're fighting back, but not really fighting. They're just unsure where they're at. And now the problem is now we can't attend to the primary because now we have a concern that something else could arose from the way custody may have been perceived as handling that inmate. But what's your thoughts on, you know, restraints and hog tying and obviously from a medical perspective? No, we have to touch on it, because I think the funny thing is that it's not something that's, believe it or not, is easily recognized. I know it may sound crazy, but when we posted the original video, there were a lot of people that thought it was textbook until someone came up and said, well, wait a second, this guy was on his stomach for a very long period of time, and the perception of it, even if that wasn't the reason, because you said there could have been other things. He fell, it hit his head. I mean, there could have been a lot of reasons that would have caused him to die 3 days later. But having said that, it was, you know, determined by medical that it was 3 days prior what happened in that incident that caused him to die. So when we talk about hog tying, I think it's something that we may not realize it's happening at that moment. So just to kind of explain it a little bit more would work for those who may not understand it. Because believe it or not, when I first saw it, it took me a while to see it. And then when Soto opened my eyes, I was like, you know what? I was so focused on the safety and security side of it all, making sure that the inmate is compliant, that I didn't realize that this person was on his stomach for that long. So again, just the information that was provided to me and made me go back and say, holy shit, he should have been sat up within that 12 minutes. So, what's your thoughts on, restraints, hog tying, and how delicate of a situation it is?
So I think, for one, particularly in this instance where we knew that the offender had a medical emergency, right? Whether we knew whether he fell off the bunk or not, anything that preceded the time that we saw on the video, we knew that he was in medical distress and that there was a possibility of him having some respiratory challenges. And so I feel like once he was in a space, because even in the beginning when he's kind of on his side, usually when you're positioned on the side, they don't want you to asphyxiate, or they don't want you to, choke on vomit or anything, right? Like the tongue relaxes in the time of seizure, like all these things happen to the body. So I feel like he was already in a medically compromised state. And so granted, whatever we have to do in order to neutralize the threat of him being combative or violent towards, the staff, any of the staff, custody or medical, once he's been neutralized, I just can't see why we would continue to. So I understand that once the restraints are removed, there's a possibility of him going back to being combative and violent. So that part I get. And so following the protocols of keeping him restrained is certainly appropriate. But when you look at the video, you look at him being on his stomach for that long, you look at him saying that he couldn't breathe, you look at even as the officers are kind of moving around, you shift pressure, right? So being hogtied, his legs are all the way back. So you think pressure on the stomach, legs all the way back, the pull that you're going to be getting in your legs from someone adding that pressure to the back of your legs. I think all of those things in combination certainly made it more difficult for oxygenated blood to get through the important parts of his body. And so I could see where they're going as far as saying the event was the cause of his death, even if, there were other underlying medical concerns.
Right. And I want to add on, again, we'll pull away from John Neville. It just happened to be one of how inmates could pass, so we had to cover it. But I also want to say, when you go into an area to restrain an inmate, try not to be so myopic in your perspective. That goes from medical side, that also goes from custody side. Okay, it's safety and security, but it's not solely safety and security. Safety and security with a goal of saving this inmate's life. And the same thing here, but medical's perspective may be a little bit different. It's the goal of saving this inmate's life within, as best can be, the confines of safety and security. If you both go in with that perspective and not so myopic, you know what I mean? Like, I'm not going in with an isolated mission. I'm not going in solely dealing with safety and security, and, medical has to squeeze their way in, or medical's not going in with, the idea of totally preservation of life and custody, safety, and security is secondary. It's going in knowing that there's a partnership and then trying to reach each other's goal at the same time, which may even include medical having a little bit of input onto, what has to be done with that inmate, and then custody being able to adapt and adjust, with saying, okay, well, we need to get him here. Let's turn. And I did see a lot of that, by the way, in that video, where medical needed these things, and it was a quick shift, no hesitation and go. And that really is a good leader and an experienced team, but definitely good working relationship between the two. So again, last piece of advice, don't go in isolated. You may represent two different departments, but the goal is save that fucking inmate's life. So how do you work together to do that? Anything you want to say before we move on to the next one, or because I saw you agreeing with that?
No, I definitely agree. Taking a more, partnered approach is definitely best. I mean, so one is just acknowledging that we understand what the mission is. And although our roles might be different, we're coming together to still, achieve the mission. And, if it's life preservation, I have to respect this is what's in your scope. This is what's in my scope. This is how I can be of support of you. And this is how you can be of support of me. And the more of that we see, I think the less, deaths we'll end up seeing.
Right now, I believe there's 2 more left that we went through yesterday. And again, it will get released at 1 o'clock tomorrow, the podcast. And then I'll ask you kind of if there's any other ones that you could think of. But I'm going to forward this one strictly to you, which is the excited delirium. Russ had mentioned that yesterday, and I actually got a chance to look it up. And yes, there's a lot of inmates that could fall into that state where they do crash. And then Russ was able, and guys, definitely check out the podcast where he was able to blend that into when restraining the inmate, how they could crash. And now it's just another emergent issue on top of what already happened. So what exactly is excited delirium, and how do we have to monitor that?
So I've only witnessed that when you have offenders coming in using some kind of drugs. They're under usually some influence, and you see this heightened state of aggravation, aggression. Usually their blood pressure is extremely high. It's almost like they're running off of this adrenaline. There's this strength in them that you just have no idea where it's come from. And quite honestly, they are one of the hardest, to stabilize. Custody usually gets in and they do their best to make sure like they're able to restrain him until he kind of comes down. But the crash is really a difficult thing to manage, because most facilities don't have necessarily all of the equipment that they would need to safely stabilize this person. Oftentimes we're able to do it, but it's not without its challenges. Essentially, it is the impact that you see either from some substance use, or even if internally they get hold of their own cocktail and they don't realize that this is how their body is going to respond to whatever they concocted. Particularly when you go to restrain that person, it is very difficult to do that.
Right. Russ did mention accidents as well in the workplace. We do have injuries that occur. Again, that could be a medical emergency as well. The last thing I want to talk about is assaults. You could have inmates that could get seriously injured in an assault. And I would like to think, again, we're going back to that communication with medical and custody, because there may be some information that custody has, including maybe the discovery of a weapon. Inmates are not going to be honest as to where their injuries are, because some of them don't want to snitch. Some of them will say, nope, I wasn't assaulted, and try to not do what the nurse is saying. Don't get me wrong. Custody can assist, obviously, but it is great to have the information at hand and to know exactly what the inmate was hurt with. They may not, there's different types of shanks that could do different types of damage. And by understanding, how the inmate was shanked up, the weapon that was used, you can kind of get a determination of what type of injury this thing could have caused. But again, that communication and the, custody immediately doing the search to try to find out what it was. And then, being able to even give the medical staff a little bit more information. So when they go to talk to the inmate knows, okay, you know what, this person knows a lot more than I thought they did. So maybe I'll go ahead and, fuck it. I'm just going to tell them the truth anyway. Sometimes, believe it or not, inmates may not want to lie. They only feel that they have to. But once they feel that the research is there and the information is provided, they don't want to get exhausted, because they know that they're just going to, lie upon lie. But this person has a lot more information. They can challenge it, and the challenging becomes exhausted. I mean, I used to teach interview and interrogation techniques, and lying is extremely exhausted. And once people have information, that information provides the inmate with saying like, okay, I know what's happening, so be careful what you tell me, because I'm going to go ahead. And it's like, I'll give you an example. We used to say this. Instead of telling somebody, or instead of asking somebody what happened, tell them, let me hear your side of the story. Because then they start to think, well, wait a second, what sides have they heard? And then they start having to try to craft over certain things, and that's where you start to see the stress come in. So whatever you could do to give medical some more information, but also let's reverse that too. after an assault, if there's something that medical discovered, maybe they should also give that, because maybe we don't know that there's a weapon involved. And all of a sudden, you know, you determine that there's an injury on the inmate that wasn't from a fist or something, that was from a weapon, was from a shank or from a lock. You can go back and tell the supervisor, hey, check this out. Even though this may have been what looks like initially fist or whatever it was, I know there was no weapon discovered. The injury he has here looks like the inmate could have been poked with something or hit with something a little bit harder than a fist. And that can go ahead and cause us to research, so it doesn't make sure that that weapon's not used again. So that communication goes both ways, correct?
Absolutely. I mean, there's very rare moments where medical will identify something and they're not going to share it with custody, especially if there is some sort of security issue that comes up, that we know other offenders could probably also be injured in the same manner that this particular one in front of us is. Certainly sharing that information, we understand the broader implications of that information. And so we don't hesitate to share. I mean, we may not go into all the details about their injuries and all that other stuff, but if there's information specific to the investigation that we know you need to have, we generally share. Now, don't get me wrong, there's some medical people that I can't, right? I don't know that you can't. You know, HIPAA is very specific, and under, I guess, the umbrella of safety and security, there is some information that we must share. That's just a reality.
Now, Connie, I know it's not an all-inclusive dialogue. Now, guys, if you have it, you want to add something else to it, please do. Maybe we can explore it on a later date. I thought we covered some of the main issues. And again, definitely the foundation of working with medical work with custody, and just being able to protect yourself from liability. Do your job. Don't give them a reason to find negligence or recklessness in what you do. Is there anything you'd like to add in closing? Did we miss anything that comes to mind?
I don't think so. I mean, I just think just do your due diligence, you know, follow your protocols. I mean, if you're supposed to do your rounds, do your rounds. You know, someone's on a watch, do the rounds in the watch. Like, I think there's no easier way for you to stay clean in these situations. Do your rounds, do your due diligence, and really, there's an emergency, you respond to the emergency. If it's something you can't handle, don't be afraid to escalate it to whatever level that it needs to go to, because the liability is significant when, in fact, these things fall apart.
Yeah, I thought it was great for us to have this dialogue, because I think the public doesn't know what we do, especially at the very beginning when I talk about, even if the inmate, we kind of have an idea that they passed, we're still going to exhaust every measure until it gets, you know, properly declared that the inmate has passed. And I think it's great for the public to see that also they're always quick to judge that we haven't done enough. But in some cases, we've gone above and beyond. There's just nothing you can do. The inmate planned it out. And I mean, suicide attempts are very unique. Again, you pull away their resources and they'll find inventive ways, you know, jumping off a tier, you know, okay, I'll put fences up so they can't do that. Okay, then I'll hang myself on a grill gate. You know, it's just very inventive, you know, hanging myself with a garbage liner, you know, like you said, flushing a sheet in the toilet. You know, these are acts of desperation, but when you're thinking about it every day, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, you're going to be very inventive. You know, we actually hopefully are able to turn that off. You know, we go home for a good portion of the day. I like to hope so. I know there's some that do work a lot more hours. But what I'm trying to get at is that we're not thinking about how to kill ourselves 24 hours a day, 7 days a week with limited resources. So, you know, when you're put in that survival mode, the ideas that you can come up with, I mean, inmates could be some of the most inventive people in the world, because out of desperation, they can come up with some crazy things that actually work, including, you know, lighting cigarettes or, you know, I mean, the list goes on, you know, creating weapons, whatever. But Connie, just in closing, do you mind reminding everybody of your venues and how they can reach you?
Sure. So we're at civiliancorrectionsacademy.teachable.com, and check out www.conniealleyne.com, where you can find, you know, support for coaching, for mentoring as you're in this profession and you want to try to figure out what your next steps are, or as you're preparing to leave this profession, what are some things that you want to do as you're going out. And then it's the Fly Behind the Wall podcast and Conversations with Connie.
All right, guys. Now, again, don't forget, check out Keepers of Chaos. Keepers of Chaos is a great Facebook community group. A lot of good stuff out there. And Don't forget, also check out the Tear Talk podcast. We do a fresh episode every Friday. It's not the same stuff that goes on here. Maybe the same topic, but usually different perspective with different guests. As always, guys, the show is Tear Talk. If you haven't, please subscribe, interact, engage, comment, hit that bell. Bell's going to notify you every time I post up a video. Please stay safe.
Whoa.